Something remarkable happened in global agricultural markets this year that few people outside the commodity trading world noticed. Starting in May, the People's Republic of China made a decisive move that sent shockwaves through international soybean markets. They cut off all purchases from American suppliers and redirected nearly 89% of their massive soybean requirements toward Brazil, a country sitting thousands of miles away across the South Atlantic. The numbers tell an extraordinary story. Within a 7-month window, Chinese importers brought in over 70 million tons of Brazilian soybeans. For farmers cultivating vast fields across Brazil's agricultural heartland, this sudden surge in demand felt like winning the lottery. The Chinese market became their golden ticket, a seemingly endless source of revenue that transformed their financial prospects overnight. The arrangement appeared mutually beneficial. China needed soybeans to feed its livestock industry and support its massive food production infrastructure. Brazil had the capacity and willingness to supply them. Trade flowed smoothly between the two nations, creating what seemed like a stable, long-term partnership that would benefit both economies for years to come. But then something unexpected happened. Brazil, perhaps sensing an opportunity or feeling emboldened by its newfound position as China's primary supplier, began testing the limits of this relationship. Over just a few months, the prices Brazilian exporters charged Chinese buyers jumped by an eye-watering 79%. This wasn't a gradual market adjustment or a response to minor supply disruptions. This was aggressive pricing behavior that fundamentally altered the economics of the trade relationship. Meanwhile, across the Pacific Ocean, American soybean farmers watched their harvest pile up in storage facilities. Mountains of unsold beans sat in warehouses from Iowa to Illinois, a silent testament to their lost market share. The situation became so dire that some observers joked the surplus was enough to keep rodents well fed for years. Yet Brazilian suppliers, confident in their leverage, kept pushing prices higher, apparently convinced that China had no alternative but to pay whatever they demanded. The Chinese response was swift and calculated. Major purchasing consortiums made a collective decision to halt all new soybean contracts with Brazil. Within 48 hours of this announcement, they pivoted dramatically, placing orders for 1.3 million tons of soybeans from Argentina instead. This wasn't just a negotiating tactic. It was a clear message that even the world's largest buyer has limits to its patience. This situation raises critical questions. What drove Brazil to risk such a lucrative relationship by implementing such aggressive price increases? Can Argentina realistically scale up production to meet China's enormous appetite for soybeans? And what does this reshuffling of global agricultural trade mean for farmers, consumers, and the broader world economy? Before we dive deeper into these questions, if you find this analysis valuable and want to stay informed about global economic developments that affect markets and everyday life, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue producing in-depth content on the forces shaping our interconnected world. Now, let's unpack this fascinating economic confrontation that's unfolding across 3 continents. To truly grasp why this matters, we need to understand China's position in global soybean markets. There's a saying in agricultural commodity circles: there are essentially 2 soybean buyers in the world, China and everyone else combined. This isn't an exaggeration, it's a reflection of mathematical reality. China's domestic soybean production falls dramatically short of its needs. The country's agricultural land is dedicated to various crops, but soybeans aren't prioritized because other countries can grow them more efficiently at scale. Consequently, China depends heavily on international markets, importing more than half of all soybeans traded globally each year. When we talk about China's purchasing power in this sector, we're discussing a market force with genuinely no parallel. Historically, the United States served as one of China's most important soybean suppliers. The relationship was substantial and mutually beneficial. According to trade statistics, back in 2017, China purchased approximately 32 million tons of American soybeans, representing a transaction value of roughly $14 billion. To put that in perspective, these Chinese purchases accounted for more than 78% of all American soybean exports during that year. For American farmers across the Midwest, the Chinese market wasn't just important, it was essential to their livelihoods. But, geopolitics has a way of disrupting even the most established economic relationships. When the United States initiated what became known as the trade war, implementing tariffs and restrictions on Chinese goods, Beijing responded with retaliatory measures of its own. One of their most effective tools was reducing soybean imports from American suppliers. The impact was devastating for American agriculture. The American Soybean Association documented that during the 2018 trade conflict alone, the U.S. agricultural sector absorbed losses approaching $27 billion. Remarkably, approximately 71% of those losses were directly connected to soybeans. Fields that once produced cash crops suddenly became liabilities. Storage facilities overflowed. Prices collapsed. Rural communities that depended on soybean farming faced serious economic hardship. By September 2025, the situation reached a symbolic milestone. Chinese soybean imports from the United States hit zero, not a single shipment. This represented the first time since November 2018 that China completely ceased purchasing American soybeans. For American farmers who had built their business models around Chinese demand, this was nothing short of catastrophic. When China decided to reduce its American soybean purchases, it didn't reduce its overall soybean consumption. The demand remained constant, driven by the nutritional needs of millions of livestock animals and the requirements of various food processing industries. China simply needed to find alternative suppliers who could deliver the volumes it required. Enter Brazil. As the world's second-largest soybean producer, Brazil possessed both the agricultural capacity and the logistical infrastructure to fill this gap. The country boasts approximately 270 million acres of arable land, with vast expanses dedicated to cultivating soybeans, corn, and rice. These three crops dominate Brazilian agriculture, representing roughly 87% of the nation's total cultivated area. The numbers from 2025 illustrate just how dramatically Brazilian exports to China expanded. Between January and August alone, China imported more than 70 million tons of Brazilian soybeans. This represented 71.6% of China's total soybean imports during that period, a staggering concentration of trade with a single supplier. By September, the monthly figures became even more extraordinary, 10 million tons in a single month, accounting for 89% of all Brazilian soybean exports during that 30-day window. For Brazilian farmers, this represented an unprecedented windfall. Fields that once competed for market share in a crowded global marketplace suddenly had a virtually guaranteed buyer for everything they could produce. Investment flowed into Brazilian agriculture. Farmers expanded their operations. Processing facilities scaled up. Port infrastructure improved to handle the increased export volumes. The entire agricultural value chain in Brazil experienced a boom period. The contrast with the American situation couldn't have been starker. While Brazilian soybeans moved quickly from field to ship to Chinese ports, American beans accumulated in storage facilities, their value gradually deteriorating. The U.S. Secretary of Agriculture made multiple public appeals for China to resume purchases, emphasizing the quality of American soybeans and the readiness of American farmers to supply them. These appeals fell on deaf ears. Chinese buyers showed absolutely no interest in returning to American suppliers while alternatives existed. From a strategic perspective, Brazil should have had a secured position for years to come. They had demonstrated reliable supply capacity, established logistics chains, and built relationships with Chinese importers. The trade relationship should have matured into something stable and mutually beneficial. But then Brazil made a critical miscalculation. According to projections from the Brazilian National Association of Grain Exporters, Brazil's soybean shipments to China for the full year 2025 were expected to surpass 110 million tons, which would establish a new record high. This should have been celebrated as a tremendous success story, a testament to Brazilian agricultural productivity and export competitiveness. However, Brazilian soybean traders apparently decided that record volumes weren't enough. They wanted to maximize their profit margins by significantly increasing prices. What followed was a series of price escalations that tested the patience of even the most accommodating buyers. The price increases began as early as April. The landed price of Brazilian soybeans arriving in Chinese ports climbed from $530 per ton to $580 per ton within a single month, an increase exceeding 10%. Some premium soybean varieties saw even steeper jumps, with quotations reaching over 4,200 yuan per ton. These represented the highest price levels seen in China-Brazil soybean trade over the previous 3 years. But honestly, this was merely the opening move. As October arrived, spot prices for Brazilian soybeans climbed yet again, with premiums reaching $2.80 to $2.90 per bushel above Chicago futures contracts, the benchmark reference for global soybean pricing. On October 22nd, the Brazilian Association of Soybean Exporters formalized their latest pricing for Chinese buyers in São Paulo, $650 per ton, up from September's $580 per ton. This represented another 12% increase in a single month. When you calculate the cumulative effect over just 6 months, Brazilian soybean export prices to China had risen by nearly 79% compared to the beginning of the year. This exceeded even the most optimistic market forecasts and transformed what had been a competitively priced commodity into what some Chinese buyers described as a luxury item. To provide context, Brazilian soybeans now cost approximately $50 to $60 more per ton than American soybeans, despite the fact that the products are functionally identical and American suppliers were desperate to move their inventory. Brazilian exporters justified these increases by claiming they needed to recover losses from previous years of market volatility. But the mathematics told a different story. If China continued importing approximately 100 million tons of Brazilian soybeans annually at these elevated prices, their total procurement costs would increase by roughly $12 billion compared to previous pricing levels. For an economy managing food security for 1.4 billion people, this represented a significant and unnecessary additional expense. So, rather than immediately retaliating, China initially pursued a diplomatic approach to resolve the pricing dispute. In early October, representatives from the China Soybean Industry Association actually traveled to Brazil to engage in direct negotiations. Their goal was pretty straightforward: bring prices back to levels that reflected actual market conditions, not just opportunistic exploitation of a concentrated supply relationship. Now, Brazil's response to these negotiations was, well, quite revealing. Rather than acknowledging the concerns of their largest customer and working toward a mutually acceptable solution, Brazilian representatives basically deflected responsibility by citing weather-related production challenges. Their explanation centered on heavy rainfall that struck Mato Grosso, which is one of Brazil's primary soybean-producing regions in the north. According to their account, these intense rains flooded about 1.2 million hectares of soybean fields, potentially reducing new season production by 5 to 8%. They also referenced continuous heavy rains from late 2024 through early 2025 in both Mato Grosso and Rio Grande do Sul that significantly delayed harvests, disrupted inland transportation networks, and reduced port shipping efficiency. The message to Chinese buyers was, honestly, unambiguous: accept current prices or wait indefinitely for market conditions to improve. It was essentially a take-it-or-leave-it proposition. However, a closer examination revealed additional factors driving Brazil's pricing behavior beyond just weather disruptions. Brazil's domestic inflation rate had climbed above 8%, creating pressure across the entire economy. Facing rising costs for labor, fuel, fertilizer, and equipment, many farmers made a strategic decision to hold their soybeans in storage rather than selling immediately, gambling that prices would climb even higher in the months ahead. The data on soybean sales ratios confirmed this hoarding behavior. In 2025, the sales ratio for Brazil's previous season's soybeans stood at only 81.4%, significantly below the 5-year average. Meanwhile, advanced sales for the new season reached just 20.5%, nearly 10 percentage points lower than comparable periods in previous years. This deliberate withholding of supply from the market created artificial scarcity that pushed prices upward. A classic case of sellers manipulating supply to extract higher prices from buyers with limited alternatives. From China's perspective, this looked less like a response to genuine market forces and more like calculated exploitation of their dependency on Brazilian supplies. Patience has limits, even for the world's largest commodity buyer. When it became clear that Brazil had no intention of moderating its pricing strategy, China deployed the most powerful weapon in any buyer's arsenal. They simply stopped buying. Major Chinese importers, including state-affiliated giants like COFCO and privately held powerhouses like Yihai Carry, suspended all new soybean purchases from Brazilian suppliers. Existing contracts signed prior to the price escalation continued to be honored. China wasn't defaulting on commitments or engaging in bad faith behavior. But starting in October, the number of fresh soybean orders placed with Brazil dropped to exactly 0. The timing of this decision couldn't have been worse for Brazilian exporters. Brazil's new season soybeans were approaching harvest and would soon flood the market, but old crop inventory remained unsold. This created the potential for a serious supply glut, precisely the situation that drives prices downward rather than upward. If this purchasing freeze continued, Brazilian soybeans faced the very real possibility of experiencing the same fate that befell American soybeans' mountains of inventory sitting in storage, depreciating in value, with no ready buyers willing to pay premium prices. For an agricultural export economy like Brazil's, few scenarios are more economically damaging. The lesson was clear: dominant market position doesn't guarantee pricing power when your customer has alternatives, patience, and the willingness to redirect purchasing elsewhere. So, where did China turn when they cut off Brazilian suppliers? The answer is Argentina, the world's third-largest soybean producer, and a country that had been operating somewhat in the shadow of the Brazil-China trade relationship. Argentina's primary soybean cultivation occurs in Buenos Aires province and Córdoba province, where climate and soil conditions create excellent growing environments. Over the past 2 years, Argentina's total soybean output has stabilized around 50 million tons annually. While this falls short of meeting China's entire import needs, it could theoretically cover approximately 45% of total demand, a substantial portion. Historically, Argentina's soybean exports to China had been relatively modest. From January through September 2025, China imported nearly 2.9 million tons of Argentine soybeans, meaningful but representing only a small fraction of Argentina's export capacity. Then, something remarkable happened. On September 22nd, the Argentine government announced a dramatic tax reduction decree. They temporarily slashed export tariffs on soybeans, soybean oil, and soybean meal to 0%. To appreciate how significant this was, consider that the export tax on soybeans had previously stood at 26%, one of the highest agricultural export taxes in the world. This policy would remain in effect until October 31st, 2025, creating a temporary window of extraordinary competitiveness. The impact on export prices was immediate and dramatic. Argentine soybean prices plummeted, becoming approximately $100 to $150 per ton cheaper than American soybeans and vastly more competitive than Brazilian offerings. For Chinese importers facing inflated Brazilian prices, this represented exactly the kind of alternative they needed. The response was swift. Within just 48 hours of the Argentine announcement, multiple Chinese companies signed approximately 20 shipping contracts totaling 1.3 million tons of soybeans. This wasn't tentative exploration of a potential supplier, it was decisive action to secure alternative sources at favorable prices. Looking ahead, Chinese traders began planning their import requirements for early 2026. As of the latest reports, several companies had already signed purchase orders for January 2026 shipment, with estimated total volumes between 8 and 9 million tons. These soybeans would be shipped between December 2025 and January 2026, ensuring continuity of supply even if the Brazilian situation remained unresolved. The American card remains unplayed. There's another option that China has carefully kept in reserve, resuming purchases from the United States. Since May 2025, China hasn't imported a single American soybean, creating severe inventory backlogs that pushed U.S. soybean prices to their lowest levels in nearly 9 years. American farmers have been vocal in calling for restored access to Chinese markets, arguing that even selling at reduced prices would be preferable to watching their harvest lose value in storage. The geopolitical calendar adds another dimension to this situation. As November approached, the 90-day tariff truce between China and the United States was scheduled to expire. According to published schedules, both nations plan to hold a new round of trade consultations in Malaysia around October 27th. For American agricultural interests, this represented a critical opportunity to reestablish market access. Additionally, the White House press secretary announced that President Trump would travel to South Korea to attend the APEC summit and plan to conduct a bilateral meeting with Chinese representatives on the morning of October 30th. According to leaked information from both delegations, the soybean issue would feature prominently in these discussions. If these negotiations produced positive outcomes, China could feasibly resume importing American soybeans in the relatively short term. This wouldn't necessarily represent a complete restoration of the pre-trade war relationship, but even partial resumption would provide China with additional supply diversification and put further pressure on Brazilian pricing. Other potential suppliers are in the wings. Beyond Argentina and potentially the United States, China has begun exploring relationships with other soybean-producing nations. Russia, for instance, has been expanding its agricultural production and could emerge as a supplementary supplier for certain soybean varieties. While Russian production volumes can't match Brazil's output, every additional source reduces China's dependency on any single supplier. This diversification strategy serves multiple purposes. Economically, it creates competitive pressure that moderates pricing across all suppliers. Strategically, it reduces vulnerability to supply disruptions from any single country. Politically, it demonstrates that China won't accept being held hostage by suppliers who attempt to exploit market concentration for excessive profits. Brazil's strategic miscalculation is becoming clear. From an outside perspective, Brazil's decision to aggressively escalate prices during this particular period appears to be a significant strategic error. The logic seems to have been straightforward. China and the United States remain entangled in trade disputes, meaning China won't return to American suppliers in the near term. Therefore, Brazil could raise prices substantially, and China would have no choice but to pay. This reasoning overlooked several crucial factors. First, soybeans aren't a unique, irreplaceable resource like rare earth minerals or advanced semiconductor chips. They're an agricultural commodity that multiple countries can produce in large quantities. The product from Brazil is functionally identical to the product from Argentina, the United States, Russia, or any other supplier. Quality differences exist, but are relatively minor and don't justify the price premiums Brazil was attempting to extract. Second, Brazil isn't the only credible supplier with the capacity to serve Chinese demand. Argentina alone could cover nearly half of China's import needs, and combinations of suppliers could easily meet the remainder. The market concentration that Brazil enjoyed was a consequence of Chinese purchasing decisions, not an inherent structural advantage that couldn't be altered. Third, China has demonstrated repeatedly that it makes long-term strategic decisions about supply chains rather than simply responding to short-term price pressures. When the trade war with the United States began, China didn't simply accept higher costs. It fundamentally restructured its soybean sourcing. The same strategic patience and willingness to endure short-term disruption for long-term positioning applies to the Brazilian relationship. Fourth, attempting to maximize short-term profits through aggressive pricing risks, destroying long-term relationship value. International trade, particularly in agricultural commodities, depends heavily on trust, reliability, and mutually beneficial arrangements. Suppliers who demonstrate opportunistic behavior when they perceive leverage tend to find themselves replaced by more cooperative partners when circumstances shift. The broader implications of this confrontation over soybean pricing are, honestly, pretty significant and extend far beyond agricultural markets. It offers insights into how economic power operates in an interconnected global economy and how even dominant market participants face constraints on their behavior. For China, this episode reinforces the importance of supply chain diversification. Concentrating purchases with a single supplier creates vulnerability to exactly the kind of pricing exploitation that Brazil attempted. Going forward, we can expect Chinese commodity buyers to maintain relationships with multiple suppliers, even when dealing with a preferred primary source, specifically to preserve competitive options. For exporting nations, this situation demonstrates the risks of confusing market share with market power. Brazil captured the majority of Chinese soybean imports, not because China lacked alternatives, but because Brazil offered competitive pricing and reliable supply.